SeanBell is a former Royal Air Force pilot and Sky News military analyst. Welcome to our program, Sean.
Daniel, always a pleasure to join you.
Vladimir Putin is destroying his own country by not making a deal over Ukraine, US President Donald Trump said. He also says that all things will only get worse for Vladimir Putin if he doesn't settle the war. Do you see recent threats from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin as a major turning point in Trump's stance on Russia?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Daniel, because President Trump, before the election, said he would solve the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. Now, nobody expected him to do that. And his people are now saying it'll be 100 days. But it is interesting to see just what influence and power President Trump now has to bring the war to an end. One of the things that generally as a military guy, wars only end when one side wins, the other side loses, or both sides have ground themselves to a stalemate and see benefit in stopping. That's not clear in this war. And at the moment, Russia appears to be on the front foot in the battles in the Donbass. And therefore, what is it that Donald Trump can do that can persuade Vladimir Putin to stop the war? And I think we're already seeing President Trump has made a number of statements around this space over the last 7 days. We can pick up on some of those, but ultimately it's still far from clear how Trump can actually influence an end to this war.
Also, Trump says, quote, "We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal." How could the hard way look like for Vladimir Putin?
Well, President Trump has alluded to the fact that he can use more sanctions, much harder sanctions against Russia. He hasn't suggested that America would join in to the fight. I think that would be most interesting because, bluntly, people like Putin only respect strength. And I suspect Russia has got used to sanctions now. As a military guy, I'm always somewhat skeptical about how effective sanctions can be, particularly in a country like Russia, which has vast oil and gas reserves that generate a lot of money. And although the West may not be buying them directly from Russia, Russia is still exporting its oil and gas. The same amount of oil and gas is being generated around the world and being consumed. So Russia is still benefiting financially from that, and it's not clear exactly what more sanctions will do. I think what was interesting, though, Daniel, is that President Trump was also, he had a carrot and a stick. In other words, looking to how could he tempt Vladimir Putin to start negotiating. And one of the carrots was he talked about NATO. He said that he understood why NATO shouldn't be an option for Ukraine. And what is interesting, I think, as a military analyst, is that when in the Cold War, I think it was 1962, the former Soviet Union positioned missiles right on the border of America, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it was known. America was very unhappy with that happening. So it shouldn't be a great surprise that with NATO moving up to the border, potentially of Russia along the Ukraine border, that is something that Vladimir Putin is not happy with. And I think it was interesting to hear Trump side with President Putin to recognize that was a concern. In other words, it was a slightly different approach that was trying to offer a temptation to President Putin to get involved in negotiations, but also making clear that if he didn't, then things could get a lot worse.
What does it mean from your perspective, this interesting statement of Donald Trump regarding NATO?
Well, again, I think I think you and I have talked before that however much a membership of NATO would be something very welcome to Ukraine, it's very difficult to see practically how that can happen anytime soon, particularly with a large element of Ukraine occupied by Russia. It's very difficult to see how that would work. So although the outgoing president President Biden was very clear he wanted to give an opportunity for Ukraine to join NATO. What President Trump is doing is creating a different conversation. He's saying he recognizes Vladimir Putin's concerns and that therefore NATO will be off the table. I think what's interesting about that, and we've not heard anything from your president at all in this space, because President Zelenskyi has made very clear in the past that whatever the future lies, he may well have to cede territory, but security for the rest of Ukraine is absolutely vital. He's regularly quoted the Budapest Memo of 1994, when Ukraine was offered some guarantees to its sovereignty, and yet 20 years later, Russia ripped the paper up. So President Zelensky will not be happy with any verbal agreement or a signed bit of paper. He'll want to see something tangible. He'll want to see Western nations committing to the defense of Ukraine, because otherwise there's a clear danger. Russia's been an aggressor to Ukraine for 300 years. Why would it stop now unless the West is to step in and help?
Does it mean direct military intervention in Ukraine? And do you think that only US deployment to Ukraine could really force Vladimir Putin to negotiate in good faith to settle the war?
I think the question of military intervention is a fascinating one, Daniel. From my perspective, the West has done enough to try to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not done enough to help it win. I'm very confident that if the West was to intervene militarily with its military advantage, which is an order of magnitude bigger than Russia holds, then Russia would be stopped in a heartbeat. Question is whether America has the appetite to do that. And it's pretty clear. President Trump has already said there is a big ocean between America and European continent. He sees America's focus as China, and he thinks Europe should be focused on Russia. NATO obviously is a lot of countries, but many of those countries do not pay their 2% of GDP spending into defense. Trump is very clear that Europe needs to step up and almost certainly take responsibility for Ukraine in its war against Russia. So I think it's very unlikely we'll see American combatants on the ground. But I was in Europe at the European Parliament only the other week, and it's pretty clear that Europe is feeling a lot closer to the heat of this battle than America is. And I suspect there is more that can be done by Europe to try to halt Russia's advances and potentially get involved in the fight if Putin continues this war.
Does this mean that EU peacekeeping forces could play a key factor in peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine? What is your take on such idea, or you think that only direct military deployment could solve the problem?
The problem with I'm convinced that President Putin knew when he invaded Ukraine, his strategic risk would have been that the West would get involved, because he would have known that he would fail if that was the case. And that's why every step of the way, Vladimir Putin has threatened the West. He's threatened nuclear war. He's threatened the West with escalations, even though actually all they've been doing is matching what Vladimir Putin has been doing. Putin knows full well that if the West was to get involved militarily, he'd be stuck. Now, Europe so far, because of the political leadership, has not had the appetite for getting involved. Let's be clear, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore there's no obligation to get directly involved. But I know I have several colleagues in Europe in the military regime, and they are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with simply using sanctions and political rhetoric to try to stop Vladimir Putin. They know that the only voice that Putin will recognize is the voice of the military, because he knows he has no answer to that. Whether the political masters have the appetite for engaging in the military fight, that remains to be seen. But every day that goes by, my colleagues in Poland, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Germany are feeling more and more nervous about what the future might hold. And that puts them closer to potentially a decision about considering in getting involved militarily in this fight.
So you're confident that only military options, only military intervention can persuade Vladimir Putin to settle the war, to agree with a ceasefire proposal?
Well, it depends, Daniel, as to what you think Vladimir Putin's ultimate objective is in this war. When I last visited Ukraine a couple of months ago, your colleagues made it clear that Putin's Russia has been at war for 300 years with Ukraine and has sought to destroy its language, its culture, its people, its infrastructure, its churches, everything. And therefore, it's very hard to see, based on that, that Vladimir Putin will stop just because he has a land bridge to Crimea and has that secure. Almost certainly, most Ukrainians will probably claim that he's going to catch breath and then be prepared to launch again. I think it's fair to say that Russia would not have expected that it would not have taken Ukraine in a matter of days. If you remember back to February of 2022, and Russia has paid a huge price for the land that it has secured. It is almost certainly not able to continue that fight in the near term. So some form of pause, whether it's a ceasefire or an end to the hostilities, probably suits Russia as well at the moment. My worry is that they may suit them in the near term, not in the long term. And therefore, in the long term, something needs to be done to protect Ukraine, to protect Ukrainians, and to stop Russia revisiting this fight in a few years' time.
And what could be a key for ensuring that Russia will not invade Ukraine again in the future after, for example, a ceasefire deal? Only US or European deployment to Ukraine, military presence here?
There have been a number of different options talked about, Daniel, including having United Nations forces on the ground. I'm a bit skeptical about that. United Nations forces are a political tool. They aren't always that effective militarily. And therefore, I think we have to be very careful that if you deploy United Nations forces and Russia decides to push again, that would massively undermine the credibility of the United Nations and the West. I think far more credible will be some bilateral or trilateral military arrangements with Ukraine and potentially the West, whether that's America, the UK, France, Poland, other nations, that all of which deploy maybe semi-permanent forces into Ukraine so that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on those forces as well. And that would create a seed of doubt in President Putin's mind that would say that there's more to risk by going again than to gain. My worry, of course, in all of this is that we are heading towards some form of potential negotiation. If that happens, it's very difficult to see Russia not emerging from that with a 20% stake of territory from Ukraine, and he will sell it as a win. It will be seen as a win by China, North Korea, Iran, and that has incredibly difficult implications for our global national security. So I'm not entirely sure that peace talks with which hand President Putin a win are going to be credible, but unfortunately it does appear we're heading that way. Ultimately, though, it is up to President Zelensky to decide the future for Ukraine. It's just not looking good in terms of choices at the moment.
Also, European officials are urging Trump's administration to commit several thousand troops to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. According to Bloomberg, only American military presence will make this peacekeeping mission a credible one. What is your reaction to this? And do you believe that only US military presence will make this mission a credible one?
I think there are a couple of issues here, Daniel. I think American presence on the ground would be a very powerful deterrent for President Putin. Unfortunately, I don't think that's coherent with where President Trump's head is at the moment. I think he has been very critical of NATO. He's been very critical of nations within NATO that believe that they can just hide under the umbrella of security that NATO provides, but not pay their way. And therefore, he wants to encourage European NATO countries to step up, not only with money, but also military capability and equipment onto the ground. So I suspect he will not see Ukraine as an American problem. He will see this as a great example of a European challenge and will therefore be pushing very hard, not only for European countries to get involved and find a solution, but also use this as a catalyst to increase defense spending across Europe. You'll know that he's currently seeking 5% of GDP for NATO countries. It used to be NATO was setting a target of 2%, and there are still a third of NATO countries that fail to meet that low bar. If it goes up to 3%, 4%, or 5%, which is exactly what America is seeking to achieve, that will certainly provide the West with a more robust military deterrence. But whether those politicians have the appetite for that at the moment, we'll have to wait and see.
Let's cover also Vladimir Putin and Kremlin. Russian dictator Putin believes that he has achieved key objectives in the war against Ukraine, according to Reuters. However, Putin is frustrated about the state of Russia's economy. Meanwhile, Russian elite becoming more favorable to the peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine, according to the Reuters sources. Don't you think that these developments can indicate Russia's willingness to settle the war, to negotiate a ceasefire?
Daniel, that may be true, but it does feel more like hope than expectation. As we've said before, I think sanctions do have an impact on Russia's economy. There is no doubt that inflationary pressures are building. That with, I think it's about 30% of spending now on defense, that this is not a sustainable model for Russia. However, if I put myself in the leadership shoes of Putin, I would be pushing very hard at the moment so that when, not if, there is a negotiation, that he's in a very strong position. That's why I believe, even though it's winter, even though there's no undergrowth to hide behind, even though it's very difficult to dig trenches in the ground, and traditionally Russia has not been on the offensive in the winter, they have been pushing very hard this winter despite the losses. All of that appears to indicate that Russia is trying to get itself into as strong as possible position, ready for that negotiation. I think that's also coherent. If you remember, the Ukrainians did an invasion of Russia into the Kursk region. And although Ukraine has been pushed out of a good proportion of that enclave now, it still has a very credible military presence. And I think Putin has been pushing hard in the Donbass to try to force Ukraine to pull out its forces. And it's also been using North Korean forces in the Kursk region to try to bolster up the Russian effort. But Ukraine has held firm. It is still having a robust defense. And therefore, it looks likely, if we do end up with some sort of negotiation, that Ukraine's holding some of the territory in Russia might be a useful bargaining chip as well. But back to your central question, do we think the pressures building on Putin will force him to the table? I don't think so. Will they be an element, a factor? I have no doubt that he would like to see the war end. He does not know just how powerful his support is back in Russia, because he controls all of the media. But it's pretty clear that the oligarchs, the generals, where the real power lies, they cannot be happy with the way this war is going. They cannot be happy with the various sanctions, that they're not able to live their lives and enjoy their wealth. There's no doubt pressure is building on Putin, but whether that crack in the dam opens in the next day, week, months, or years, it's very difficult to tell.
Also, US President Donald Trump says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyi wants to make a deal, but Trump is not really confident about whether Putin would like to make a deal. From your perspective, why is there such focus on President Zelenskyi's willingness to settle the war, to make a deal?
I think we've got to be careful, Daniel, about the language here. You know, President Trump has made his fortune around doing deals. You're hired, you're fired. He's made his fortune in real estate, and he knows that a deal is to be done. That's what he puts his, and he's doing that with American foreign policy. He's doing that with a lot of the headlines that he's been grabbing and some of the orders that he's been signing in the first week of his time. What he's effectively saying is, this war isn't to anybody's benefit. We need to bring it to a close. The concern is that, of course, Trump will be simply concerned with having successfully ceased the war in Ukraine, having that on his CV. The problem is that if you don't resolve the underlying problems, in other words, create the security for Ukraine long term, make it clear that Putin is not rewarded for these ambitions, then the danger is what next? We haven't even talked about Belarus, but that's another country which Russia has been gradually seizing control of. It hasn't attacked militarily, but it's now got itself embedded in that country. And almost certainly that will be the next prize that President Putin will effectively seize. This is not the end of not the beginning of the end with Ukraine. It looks like the end of the beginning.
What would it take for US President Donald Trump to help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I think that depends on what the position of strength is. I as a military guy, I don't believe sanctions are going to solve this. I think President Putin has to think that he will get badly damaged if he continues. And the only way to do that is to bring Western power to bear. Western air power would be the first obvious choice because it would absolutely dominate Russia. Russia would not have an answer to that. And Ukraine has done it spectacularly well, but it's very difficult to fight a modern war without having air cover, which it doesn't have. So I do think that if President Trump really wants to get this war to an end and force President Putin to the table, military involvement is the way to do it. Whether he's prepared to threaten that or not, it'd be interesting to see what his advisors say. There's no appetite in America that I can see at the moment for getting involved in a war in Ukraine. But ultimately, the only language which President Putin understands is that of military threat. That is, it seems to me the West has to stand toe to toe with President Putin. Otherwise, he might stop because it suits him. But whether it actually stops him coming again, that's another matter.
So you're confident that only a no-fly zone will help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I'm not saying that's the only way. I really hope that President Putin is brought to the table without having any force applied. But my worry is that if you look at it from a negotiating position, President Zelenskyi doesn't appear to have much to play on that negotiation, whereas President Putin seems to have most of the aces in his hand. And therefore, how do you create a bit more balance so that there is a meaningful negotiation where there are compromises on both sides and ultimately peace is secured? I don't see that happening without military engagement, and the no-fly zone is probably the least risk, but the most obvious benefit way to do that.
And what could be the most riskiest type of deployment to Ukraine? From your perspective, if Donald Trump, for example, goes all in and says that he would like Ukraine to actually win this war?
I'm not sure that there's a risk. I mean, ultimately, the risk people keep talking about is the threat of starting nuclear war. And I'm very confident that that is not on the table. People forget, I was in the military when we were in the Cold War. We lived under the threat of nuclear war. It's abhorrent. Nuclear weapons are dreadful. But their very existence means that it will be mutually assured destruction were anybody to use nuclear weapons. So I'm confident that Russia would have everything to lose and nothing to gain by triggering a nuclear war. What the West has to do is match Putin, stand toe to toe with him. And therefore, I think whilst it would undoubtedly cause frictions and escalations, I'm confident that unless you deal with people like Putin, very aggressively, then we will have this problem returning again. Just imagine other nuclear nations like Iran like North Korea, when they get nuclear weapons, not if, when they do, if people aren't prepared to stand toe to toe with them, we are effectively saying that those countries can do what they like around the world. That is not a world in which I am comfortable at all. We need to be able to stand firm. We need to be able to stand up to bullies like Putin. And I think the only way to do that robustly is military engagement. I hope that is something that's on the table, because otherwise I worry that President Putin will pause, regenerate, and in a few years he'll be back again.
From your perspective, so even if the West enters the fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will not use any kind of nuclear weapons.
I think Putin will be absolutely stupid to trigger a nuclear war, which he knows he cannot win. Putin is all about his legacy. It's all about restoring Russian greatness again. If Russia starts something that ends up leveling Moscow and getting rid of his legacy, then his legacy will be absolutely awful. I'm very confident that he will do lots of threatening behavior, but the whole premise of nuclear weapons is neither side wins. President Putin is the one who has invaded Ukraine. President Putin is the one responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives being lost and for millions of people being relocated. We have allowed him the luxury of believing that he is not vulnerable to attack. We must correct that if we are to stop this happening in the future.
Let's cover also Russia's position in Syria. So according to the recent reports, Syria's new government has terminated Russia's 50-year lease for the Tartus naval base, forcing Russian Navy to evacuate its fleet and military personnel. What is your take on such developments, and how can this influence Russia's position around the globe and during the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, I mean, we haven't got time to go into the detail of Syria, but there is no doubt that Russian forces helped keep Assad in power for many, many years. The Russian Air Force particularly bombed a lot of the soldiers on the ground and therefore stopped them presenting a threat. Therefore, there'll be little love lost with the new administration in Syria, and no surprises that Russia has been thrown out. I think what was interesting is, of course, that the uprising happened at a time when also you've got the forces of Hezbollah that would normally have gone to the aid of Assad. They've been badly mauled with the fight with Israel as well. So it was a sort of case of opportunism, and it showed just how thinly that Russian forces are spread and how much that things can change very swiftly. Russia likes to cause mischief around the world, inciting uprisings just to cause issues around the world in support of their own agendas. I think this has been an interesting wake-up call for Russia, and it will be very keen, I suspect. It's another reason why they will want to end the war in Ukraine, at least in the near term, so they can consolidate, lick their wounds, and work out what they're going to do next.
Let's also cover the US foreign policy. Donald Trump is serious about taking control over Greenland. And according to Financial Times publication, there was a really interesting phone call between Trump and Prime Minister of Denmark. From a strategic point of view, would Greenland make US army, US power more stronger around the globe?
I think, Daniel, you have to look at its geography. The shortest distance between America and Russia goes over Greenland. And therefore, there is a military base, a US military base on Greenland that looks at early warning, provides early warning notification for Russian missiles coming over the pole there. In addition, though, there's a lot of natural resources in Greenland. And although Denmark effectively owns Greenland, the Greenlanders themselves, there's not many of them, couldn't really present a realistic defense if Russia, China, or somebody else decided to invade them. And that country is strategically important, not just for America, but for the security of the West. So much as I don't think that President Trump is going to invade, it does highlight just how important that region is. But you have to, I think, Daniel, we've talked about Trump a lot today. One of the things that I think he's very big on is rhetoric, not always so good at delivering. And I think another area where he talked about the Panama Canal and threatening that he was going to seize that potentially by military force. But if you look at the history of that canal, it was initially started by France, but basically the project failed because it was so vast. America took it on, opened in 1914, and America ran it till 1977. And then they handed over a period of 20 years for the Panamanian Canal Authority to run it. But of course, since then, the charges for going through that strait have risen. My understanding is the average charge for a ship is now $50,000. President Trump has said, "Wait a minute, we dug that, we paid for it, we ran it, we gave it to you, and now you're charging us $50,000 for every crossing, and China is stepping in to help run it." No, we can't have that. And all he's doing is he's threatening to set the scenes for a negotiation. So I think a bit like Greenland, there's a lot of rhetoric around Trump. Let's just see how it gradually forms into policy, because it's one thing talking about it, it's quite another doing anything about it.
Also, some military experts suggest that obtaining Greenland for the US would be really beneficial, for example, for intercepting Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile in case of their launch. What is your take on that? Do you agree with such a logic?
Well, as I said, Daniel, the US has a base on Greenland, and it's there to track missiles coming from Russia, because the shortest distance from Russia to America is over the top of Greenland. So we have seen a lot of Western nations haven't really focused on long-range ballistic missiles as a threat since the Cold War. But of course, Russia has been launching those into Ukraine regularly, and Iran has launched a whole load into Israel. And all of a sudden, that's heightened all nations' awareness of what's their ability to detect, track, and destroy these long-range weapons. I know I speak to you now from the United Kingdom. Although we have radar setups, we used to have missile systems like Bloodhound that were available to take out such missiles. Today, we don't have that defense because we haven't invested in it, because we haven't thought it's a realistic threat to our country. I think the attacks over the last couple of decades have demonstrated there's an increased threat to all of our nations, that we have to be aware that long-range ballistic missiles can cause a lot of damage, and therefore you need to have preparations, not only to detect them, but also track them and destroy them. And that is why areas like Greenland are so vital.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much. Chip Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chip.
Good afternoon, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to begin with the recent statements from US President Donald Trump. Trump threatens Vladimir Putin with tougher measures, with the war getting worse if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on a ceasefire in Ukraine. Do you feel that the tide is turning against Vladimir Putin right now with the Donald Trumps in the White House?
Well, one thing about Donald Trump is he's a sort of muscular transactionalist, and one of the difficulties at the moment, possibly with that approach, is exactly what we've seen in his approach to Greenland and possibly Canada and Panama, in that someone like Vladimir Putin could see this as an equivalence that, hey, if it's okay for you to make these threats and take things, why can't I? So, sort of policy by Twitter or by stream of consciousness is not the really real way to make policy. So I think we need to just go back to his first mentions, really, of Ukraine when he was campaigning again, really, for the second time. And that would take us back to May 23, and his notion that in terms of the war, he didn't think in terms of winning or losing. He thought in terms of stopping the killing. Now, we might term that a humanitarian peace, i.e. stop the war. And he said that again when he was in Notre Dame on the 7th of December last year. But of course, the problem with that is a ceasefire without any negotiations, or a ceasefire without Russia withdrawing to the 1991 boundaries, is it rewards the aggressor. So that's our left of arc, that he might think of a humanitarian peace, stopping the killing. And that by itself is a good thing, the basic human security need for life. The sort of middle part, I think, of the spectrum we're looking at is General Keith Kellogg's appointment as the envoy, when he, in the run-up to the Trump coming to power, sort of said that he would say something like to Zelensky, come to the table or we'll give you no support, but to Putin, come to the table or we'll give Ukraine all the support they need. And that's partly what we're talking about at the moment. Now, the problem with that at the moment is we don't really know what's on the table. What we do know from Kellogg is the one day I'm going to end the war from Putin is past, and Kellogg is certainly now looking at something like a 100 days time frame. I think that's wildly optimistic itself. But the things that they were looking at in terms of Kellogg as part of Trump's transition team were things like a 800-mile demilitarized zone and enforcing presence of whatever size force you want. 5 brigades of 40,000 was a discussion between Macron and the Poles, 100,000's being mentioned. I don't see how any of that is going to be acceptable to Putin, should there be any negotiations, when actually in that respect you achieve something which he's always tried to avoid, which is NATO troops on your border. And the third part of what Kellogg has said was that there should be security guarantees. I think whatever happens, that is vital for Ukraine, because one of the other notions which has been used very recently, both by the National Security Advisor, Waltz, and by Kellogg, is the notion of a sustainable peace. And that is going to be the key thing for Ukraine, not just a just peace, but also a sustainable peace. Now, the right of arc on the support which might come from Ukraine is really, for me, what came out of the Helsinki Commission in September. That is the commission in America under Joe Wilson, who's a South Carolina Republican, which looks at American-Russian relations, which sort of said, when Donald Trump understands the nature of Putin and that he is never going to negotiate in an honest sense, then he will really know the nature of the man and regime, and is likely to go to that right of the arc of Kellogg's thing, that he might support Ukraine with everything that they have. And, the leverage which Trump has is pretty significant in terms of both the volume of aid, either military, humanitarian, or fiscal, his notion of ameliorating the oil prices to also exacerbate the situation with the deep battle strikes on the oil and gas infrastructure, which Ukraine are doing very successfully at the moment. And the last part of that triumvirate would be the tightening the sanctions and possibly using the $300 billion of frozen assets. So all that looks pretty optimistic in the support for Ukraine. I think we have to be, the one point of realism I'd put in here, that Peskov also recently said that the price of oil is irrelevant to the continuation of the war. And I think we always have to bear that in mind, because ultimately authoritarian leaders who have variables themselves, because Putin could get further support from Iran, North Korea, or China, ultimately fight wars for political objectives. They've not really achieved any of those political objectives. And one of the reasons I think that Putin has said that he'd want a one-on-one with Trump, and therefore to exclude the agency of President Zelensky and the West, European NATO, the Bucharest Nine, however you want to frame it, is because he sees potentially that if he could play to the narcissism and ego of Trump, then he might be able to achieve more than he would in a negotiated framework in a multilateral sense.
If Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on Ukraine, Do you expect big confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Do you expect Trump to use all necessary means to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Well, we have a pressure strategy. That is what is ongoing at the moment from Trump. What I don't see is any of this notion where people always go to this maximalist position that we're likely to have a World War III with the introduction of further weapons. I think one of the things that we've sort of seen with the demise of the Biden regime and the start of the Trump regime is actually it seems that with the very clever attacks on the oil and gas infrastructure, that some of the sort of notions of escalation management, which Biden was always afraid of, seem to have been lifted. And for example, the attack this week on the Ryazan refinery prior to the war, that was 5% of refining capacity of Russia came from that Ryazan refinery. So the strategic targeting of the Ukrainians versus the sort of minor tactical gains, although they are tactical gains, of the Russians seems to me to be the way to go at the moment, because the losses from a Russian perspective make no operational or strategic sense at the moment, but only an absolute autocracy could sustain that. And that is something that they may be able to sustain unless Putin and Russia goes to the notion of strategic culmination. And they might. Sometime during this year, it might be that the economy implodes or the banking system under what has been mooted as the Cyprus scenario. That is that, you capitalize everyone's savings into shares and people generally will lose 85% of their savings to keep the Russian economy afloat. And the third part of that is that the refurbishment rates of the from the Russian inventory seems to have peaked. So this is a period of a problematic period potentially for Russia. But as I said, authoritarian regimes keep going. And one of the lessons I think I learned from Prigozhin when he was knocking around Bakhmut was that he said that we might need to live like North Korea for a few years. And there's always the notion that potentially the Russian people could endure more pain to ensure that Putin remains in power and tries to achieve his objectives, his operational and strategic objectives in Ukraine, which he hasn't at the moment.
Do you think that Trump's administration is greenlighting Ukrainian strikes inside Russia right now?
Well, they've not put a red card on them, so that's the most important thing. And I think certainly from the perspective of General Kellogg, the special envoy, and as an ex-military three-star, he has a pragmatic realism in terms of the approach to how you might win a war. Now, obviously, fighting generally stops for 1, 2, or 3 reasons, either because of decisive military victory, that doesn't look on the cards at the moment, or because of the improbability of military victory, that seems more on the cards, but Putin still believes that strategic patience is on his side, or thirdly, because of unacceptable costs, either economically, politically, militarily, or within the population. That is what Ukraine seeks to do at the moment, and actually what Putin sought to do in terms of, again, going for the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. We also need to understand why fighting doesn't stop. And one of the reasons fighting doesn't stop is because of the need for sufficient victory to justify the cost or sacrifice already incurred. So Putin will fight on in a forever war at the moment until he, one of those bits of the Clausewitzian trinity of the army walk off the battlefield as they did in 1917, or the population get fed up, or because there is elite defection. One of those three will probably pertain in the future. I'm not sure that will be 2025. I hope it is. But it's more likely that Putin is on the strategic defensive rather than Ukraine. And although there are some minor, as I said, tactical gains for Putin, as long as there is steadfast support from both Europe and America, and even if America were to withdraw that, I think the Europeans should stand up to the pitch. Then this thing has a hope. Because it is Trump's number one foreign foreign policy priority to come to some sort of denouement, if not in 25, then sometime down the line. And the reason I'm saying not 25, but somewhere down the line, is negotiations can be very complex. And for example, it took 500 meetings and 2 years to get to the armistice in the Korean War in 1953.
Do you feel that Donald Trump has enough leverage over Vladimir Putin to force him to make serious concessions to Ukraine during the negotiations?
Well, the notion of negotiations anyway is you have to, I think, put a slight caveat on that as well. That is a Western desire. It is not necessarily at the moment a Putin desire. So I think there'll still need to be more damage to Russia, significant damage at the strategic level to the oil and gas refineries before you get him to a position where he would even contemplate negotiations. And for example, I think it was Lavrov who said that a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. So, they want to go somewhere, and that somewhere is still to achieve their political objectives, which are to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That includes Ukraine and to roll back to the pre-1997 borders in terms of NATO expansion.
So it seems like Russia will not enter negotiations, will not be ready to settle the war if not enough damage is inflicted on Russian economy, Russian army, and if Vladimir Putin faces not enough pain.
Well, that's my assessment of it, and partly the reason is so one of the leverages which Trump has said is the oil price. So try and get Saudi Arabia on side to reduce the oil price to $45 a barrel. Now, I looked this week at what the price of a barrel of oil was. It's $75 at the moment, and the price of a barrel of oil veers and haws based on geopolitical factors and other factors in the world. So, for example, just after the attack on the 7th of October in the Middle East in the Gaza-Israel war, price of a barrel of oil was $90. Russia would suffer significantly if a barrel of oil were down to $45, but then so would Saudi Arabia, which needs a certain level of a barrel of oil to sustain its own geo-economic future in terms of its growth program to Vision 2030. So just because Donald Trump says something doesn't mean it's a policy. The price of a barrel of oil may come down, and that is a significant factor, but Putin has been very good at finding ways around the sanctions, even if they were strengthened, which is again one of the other leverage points of Trump. We know that there's this shadow fleet of 183 vessels, which is taking the oil around the sort of world on behalf. That will probably be clamped down on. So there is leverage here. You can use potentially those $300 billion in frozen assets to support Ukraine if you unlock those from those frozen assets in the West. But I don't think it's going to happen in the next 1 week or 2 weeks. And I guess that Trump's recalibration is that he would like to see the end of the war in 6 months. So you've gone from he can sort it in 1 day to now 6 months. I would be optimistic that that would be the time frame as well. I absolutely want it to be, but we shall have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
From your perspective, what should Donald Trump do in the matter of military support for Ukraine to force Vladimir Putin to negotiate a ceasefire on appropriate terms? What should be done in terms of Trump's administration, security assistance, and maybe lifting some restrictions on American strikes on Russia with American weapons?
Yeah, I think the weapon that they'd really like, Ukraine would really like, is the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which the range is way outside any of the range that we've seen so far, or just about. But, you have to give agency, I think, here to Ukraine. I mean, the fact that the strikes overnight of the oil installations overnight were 800 kilometers away shows that the development of both the missile and drone technology of the Ukrainians and the fact that 40% of the weapons on the battlefield are now indigenously produced by the Ukrainians shows that, we need to give agency to the Ukrainians as well. But the introduction of those weapons, American weapons with that sort of range and sophistication, the radar evading, their ability to sort of evade EW jamming and things like that, that over most weapons would devastate more parts of the oil and gas infrastructure of the Russians. And then you may get to the point when you have this sort of elite defection in Russia saying, the 3-day special military operation is turning into a 3-year nightmare. Something needs to be done to unlock this.
Let's cover also Russia's position in Syria. There have been some reports that the lease for a Tartus naval base has been reduced for Russian because new Syrian government has refused Russian army to preserve their military presence in Syria. How can you assess this big failure of Vladimir Putin there, and how can it influence Russia's position around the globe?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the fall of the Assad regime on the 8th of December coincided with Trump being in Europe when he went to the opening of Notre Dame, and when he said, come on, Assad has fallen, let's have a ceasefire and negotiations now in Ukraine. That's what he said on the 8th of December to Putin. And of course, nothing has happened since the 8th of December to make that reality. Now, the key thing about Syria from a Russian perspective was that the HTS Tahrir al-Sham, who are now de facto the Syrian government, hated Russia, saw them as enemy number one, alongside enemy number two, the Iranians, because they saw that as the Iranians is trying to impose an imperial Persian order on the Middle East. So they were never, Russians, going to have any footprint in Syria for the future post the 8th of December. Now, my understanding is that in the last couple of days, the Syrians have actually allowed some of the ships in to start unload or loading the Russian equipment from Syria. And my estimation, along with most others, is that equipment will not go to back to Russia. It will go to Libya, because effectively Russia has lost its footprint in the Middle East, and needs to try and do something to make sure its lines of communication into Africa, where it still has significant interest, particularly in sort of Sudan, Chad, the post-Wagnerian period, that works in its favor. But was Syria a strategic setback for Russia? Yes, it was, along with it being the most significant strategic setback for Iran since 1979.
Let's cover also recent Donald Trump's statements on Greenland and Panama Canal. What is your assessment of this Trump's intention to take control over Greenland due to its importance for U.S. national security?
Well, as I said, one of the things which is the difficulty of what he said is that it gives Vladimir Putin the notion of equivalence, that you've got one leader who wants to break the UN Charter when he talks about potentially invading or using military force in another country. I mean, under the UN Charter, Article 2, brackets 4, close brackets, there are only two occasions when you're allowed to go to war. That is either when authorized by a UN Security Council resolution or in self-defense under Article 51. Neither of those would pertain in terms of Greenland. Also, it is absolutely unheard of for democracies to attack other democracies. That would be a first if it were to be done. Now, I think we need to put that aside, because Trump's rhetoric is the way that Trump does business, and there's a difference between rhetoric and policy. If you then go on to the significance of Greenland and you take away from the Mercator projection of the world that we all know and love, and look down from the North Pole, then you do see the significance of Greenland in terms of the Arctic ice sheets being melting away, and therefore both the trade routes and missile routes and things like that all coming into play in the 21st century. So it is absolutely correct that if you looked at from the 20th century, one of the things which is always important there was a thing called we call the GIUC, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. That was where you needed a significant naval presence to interdict Russian submarines coming down, for example, in the Cold War. So the significance of Greenland will be amplified in the 21st century with the melting of the ice. Now, if you look at the northern tip of Greenland as well, and just go across to Canada, there's always been a Canadian base, a place called Alert, which has been part of the NORAD missile defense system. So Greenland, in terms of missile defense, early warning, all that sort of stuff for the 21st century is vital. But you don't need to start threatening a democratic ally to do that. You come up with a status of forces agreement and place your forces there as are required to make sure that you've got both sovereign security and collective security.
Also, US President Donald Trump has directed to create an iron shield, iron dome over the United States to intercept all air threats. What is your reaction to this development, and can the US government really create such an air shield to intercept all air threats, missiles, which could be fired at the United States?
Well, there's no such thing as absolute security, and this is a follow-on from Ronald Reagan's Star Wars notion of the sort of early 80s. But one of the things that led to, of course, was that the Russians, for example, and probably here we're talking about the future opposition being China than the Russians. That notion of that was one of the things that probably led to the end of the Cold War, because Russia just couldn't keep up technologically and in economic terms with the power of America. That is Russia's problem today. It can't do any of those things. It is a different ballgame if the future adversary is China. And this is where you, again, come circularly back to Ukraine, because another of the things that Keith Kellogg has said is that the defeat of Russia would be significant in that it would take a major adversary off the table, leaving America to focus on its principal adversary for the 21st century, which is China.
And let's cover also our final topic, the situation in the Middle East and this big ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Do you expect the ceasefire to last for a long time, for a while? Do you expect these deals to survive the next months and even years?
I would doubt it. So because it was a 3-phase agreement, phase 1 was always going to be the easiest phase, the first 42 days, the 6 weeks, when you have 33 Israeli hostages released on a basis of 1 to 30 for a Israeli civilian, 1 to 50 from an Israeli soldier. I think the problem we'll start getting at is when they start negotiating phase 2, which is day 16, and the complexities of that. So I think there'll be major bumps and hurdles into that. Do I see an enduring ceasefire? No, but there'll be something like a war between the wars, where Israel will always have the notion of raiding when it needs to in the future to preserve its security. And if it thinks there's a threat from Hamas, then it will destroy them. Now, if you look at what the Israelis originally said in their 2020 warfighting Operation for Victory doctrine, it was that Hamas were a rocket-based terror army. They're no longer rocket-based. I think that capability has been largely negated. They're probably no longer an army. Yes, we have seen lots of people parading with weapons when the hostages have been released, but that's performative politics as much as anything, not necessarily military capability. So, hope for the best. Let's hope a ceasefire endures, but plan for the worst. But what I do think is there's an opportunity not for necessarily a two-state solution, but for further normalization in the Middle East, bringing in Saudi Arabia, etc. But for that to happen, you do need not necessarily a roadmap for peace, but a map of something which has incremental steps for the future to try and make sure that a ceasefire endures on and on and on.
Thank you, Major General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.